Welcome to my world of stuff. Hope you're all fit and well and enjoying the current clement weather. Right, this video is a follow-up to my previous video, which was the unboxing of the new season 23 Doctor Who Blu-ray set. As I mentioned in that video, I was going to take a look at the new special features and just have a general look at the disc, and then I would come back and talk about the package as a whole with a specific and particular reference to the new special features, which for me are always the attraction of these sets. We've had 10 or 11 previous box sets, and many of those have been the later seasons of classic Doctor Who, which I must admit I'm not hugely enamoured of. However, I am aware that each of these sets contains copious, irresistible new special features, interviews, behind the scenes things, just very well produced and very well considered new features that look at the history of Doctor Who and that particular era of Doctor Who, and I'm always up for that sort of stuff. I love that sort of stuff. So even though I'm not a fan of, say, the Colin Baker, Sylvester McCoy era, the box sets have been worth buying for the sake of completism, because I am a completism and I am looking forward to, if I'm spared, one day having a complete 26 box set, Blu-ray set selection of Doctor Who. That would be a fantastic thing, with all the supporting features from the DVDs and all the new material. So that's my particular fascination with these sets and why I like to get them, even though the episodes aren't favourites. So that's a particular case in point here with season 22. This, as I mentioned in the previous video, is the season that led to Doctor Who really falling out of favour at the BBC. Michael Grade, who was the controller at the time, was no fan of science fiction in general, Doctor Who in particular, and effectively cancelled the series halfway through its run, citing poor viewing figures, the fact that the show was out of touch, and was no longer in a post-Star Wars age able to meet the audience's science fiction expectations, if you like. And the show never really recovered. I mean, it staggered on for another 4 years, but it was holed below the surface, if you like, and it slowly sank over the next few years. And I'm not a fan of these episodes. As I've said, I can, with hindsight, I can see why the decision was made, because it's not a great batch of episodes. I've only looked in a perfunctory fashion at the episodes. I've watched the first episode of Attack of the Cybermen, the first episode of the series, and it just doesn't stand up very well. I mean, it doesn't stand up to what we're aware of the production values of TV as it is now, and it doesn't really hold up to the production values of TV at the time, 1980, early 1985. It's an episode that is full of nods for fans, and I think that's the problem with the series at this particular time. John Nathan Turner, the producer, I think possibly aware that the show was leaking its public appeal, was trying to appeal more to the fan audience and get the acclaim of the fan audience to keep the show afloat. But I think that that's a misjudged way of approaching a show like Doctor Who, because of the weight of its history. Even then, it had a 22-year history of mythology, and that's very dense and very hard for a casual audience to get to grips with. And I think Attack of the Cybermen doesn't help, because it's all bound up with Telos and previous Cybermen stories, little references back to the beginning of Doctor Who, which are going to leave a casual audience cold. Plus, as a production, it's quite well directed by Matthew Robinson, but it just feels a bit tired and it feels a bit running on empty. As I said, that's the only actual episode from this box that I've watched so far. I have, however, seen bits of them in the special features. Now, I'll talk about the special features now, because that's particularly what this video is about, particularly for those who haven't bought the sets yet and are wondering if it's worth it. There may be some spoilers about the content of those features, because I think I need to mention the content in some detail with reference to the bits that I particularly enjoyed or wasn't too happy with. So apologies if this does spoil anything for anybody who hasn't watched those features yet. So the appeal of these sets, as I said, is the new special features. And one of the features that they have on each of these sets is the behind the sofa featurettes. They're about half-hour episodes for each story in the season, where Doctor Who on screen and behind the scenes talent will watch, I believe it's a truncated version of the episodes. They don't sit there all day watching the entire season, but I think they watch sort of selected edits, highlights of the stories, and then pass their opinion on them. These features can be a little bit tedious because at the end of the day, we're watching jobbing actors who either worked on this show during those episodes or are connected with Doctor Who tangentially, having been in it previously or since, watching stories that of a show that they worked in, but possibly aren't as fervent about as the fans. These are actors, and they're closely connected with Doctor Who and always will be, but they're not necessarily fans of Doctor Who. They're not familiar with the mythos, and that's very much the case here. You get three different combinations of people. The rather odd combination of Sylvester McCoy, the Seventh Doctor, with Wendy Padbury, who played Zoe in Patrick Troughton's era. I would imagine she's here because of the Two Doctors, which features the return of Patrick Troughton and Fraser Hines. You also get Colin Baker, the Doctor, Nicola Bryant Perry and Terry Malloy, who played Davros in the last story of this season. And the third combination is the regular combination of Peter Davison and his companions, Janet Fielding and Sarah Sutton, Tegan and Nyssa. They're generally there, and their contributions mainly seem to exist with Peter Davison being a bit sniffy about everything, being a bit sarky about his successors, and just generally being a bit sort of I'm trying not to say that he's not slagging it off exactly, but he's a bit sort of he doesn't take it very seriously, and he's not ashamed to point out production deficiencies, acting deficiencies and so on. For example, they're watching Time Last Show, and I think everybody's sort of taking the rise out of the late Paul Darrow's very arch Laurence Olivier type interpretation of Malin Tekka in the frankly terrible story. So you get these features across all these stories, and they're sort of entertaining. And that's really how I've revisited these stories in a way. It's reminding me of certain things about these episodes and why I don't particularly like them. But they're quite entertaining, but they're sort of skippable. They're not essential parts of these sets, but they're nice to see. For me, the four main attractions on this set are the three new interviews by Dr. Matthew Sweet, and there's a feature where Colin Baker and Nicola Bryant go back to the locations of three of the stories here, those being Attack of the Cybermen, Mark of the Rani, and Revelation of the Daleks. There's also a very nice new making of behind the scenes feature about the Two Doctors, which I don't think we had in the previous set. So those are the five main new attractions for this particular set. I'll talk about the latter two first. The making of is fairly standard. It's the usual Talking Heads compilation. It's got Colin Baker, Fraser Hines, actor Tim Raynham, who played one of the Sontarans, some archive footage of the late Clinton Grain, who played one of the Sontarans, one of the production assistants, and it's just talking about, travelling to Spain, making the story. It's sort of familiar stuff, but it's quite nice to have it in a contemporary context. It is a very standard 40-odd minute piece, but it's enjoyable. Then we have another very nice piece, which is Location, which I've said shows Colin Baker and Perry and Nicola Bryant revisiting the suburban locations of Attack of the Cybermen. Then the Heritage Museum site where Mark of the Rani was filmed, and then this sort of remote farmhouse where, and the former IBM headquarters where Revelation of the Daleks was filmed, which has Graham Harper, the director, popping up, and a very nice scene where they go back to the part of the location where the TARDIS was set up, and the TARDIS has been set up there in that location where the TARDIS landed in the snow. It's not one of my favourite stories, but it's nice to see. I'm very interested in sort of revisiting old locations. I think that's fascinating. I love to see places where things were filmed and just thinking, oh wow, so-and-so happened here, so-and-so stood there. There's a sort of romance about that sort of thing, I think. Very much enjoyed those features, but the highlights are these three Matthew Sweet interviews, which are unmissable. They're all very lengthy. And Matthew Sweet, we know, has done all these previous interviews with Tom Baker, Peter Davison, Sylvester McCoy. They're always fascinating because Matthew Sweet has a way about him. He's very charming. He's very genuinely interested in his interviewees. He seems to like them, obviously because he's a Doctor Who fan, so he's interested. but he seems to get them to open up in ways they might not have done before. And I think that's particularly true in this particular set, because we're talking about people who are involved in Doctor Who in a troubled time in its history. It was under fire at the BBC, its ratings were slipping. It was just drifting out of the public consciousness, as I said, post-Star Wars. And what he does here, he gets to the nitty-gritty in a pleasant way. The first one that I watched is the interview with Michael Grade, who was the controller of BBC One at the time and controversially axed Doctor Who in a BBC plot. And we now know historically that his plan was to scrap the series completely. He just thought, well, it wasn't very popular, no one's really going to miss it now. And he quietly axed it. And his plan was that it would be axed permanently. And I always find that sort of baffling in retrospect, because let's remember that 18 months later, the show had this massive 20th anniversary celebration in Longleat House with thousands and thousands of people turned up. And it's a little bit scary to think that the show's fortunes could decline that quickly, that in less than 2 years later it was being axed. Saner heads at the BBC prevailed once the furore erupted and the press jumped on board this latest BBC scandal. And Bill Cotton, who was the Director General of the BBC at the time, stepped in, and Doctor Who continued for a few more years. What we have here is a 50-minute piece where Matthew Sweet sits down with Michael Grade, and he talks about this particular period. I enjoyed this least of the three interviews, mainly because Michael Grade still has that arrogance about him. There's no sign of contrition or thoughtfulness or regret. He still takes the view that what he did at the time was the right thing. I think it was the right thing. In that I think Doctor Who needed a change. I don't know if it needed to be cancelled or axed, but it just needed new blood. It needed a new production team, and that's what it didn't get. So I think he had a point in that Doctor Who was looking tired and jaded and outdated, but I'm not sure that cancelling it was the right thing to do. If you've got a brand that's as popular and well known as that, you don't sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. You top up the water and you refresh the water. And he didn't want to do that. And in this interview, he still has that arrogance of a man who does not think he's done anything wrong ever in his career, I think. I don't think he ever accepts that he ever made a misstep. And he still stands up for his position because he doesn't like science fiction anyway. And I think he sort of grudgingly admits that modern Doctor Who is a triumph visually, but it's still not his cup of tea. He admits to watching that first series with Christopher Eccleston and thinking it was brilliantly made, but not his cup of tea. And I'm not sure that a controller of a channel, although I don't think we have specific channel controllers at the BBC now, I don't think they should be commissioning programmes on the basis of what they particularly like. This is the point that Nicola Bryant makes in her interview. It's about providing for a full audience. And I think that perhaps he brought his dislike of science fiction to the table and got rid of this show, which was old and tired and creaky, rather than trying to rejuvenate something which was a money spinner for the BBC. He just wanted to get rid of it. So his interview is a little bit frustrating because there is still this wall of, I was right, I did the right thing. And he still doesn't really understand why it was a big thing, why it was a fuss. He just wanted to brush it under the carpet. He just wanted to move on at the time with other things he was doing. He didn't think it was an important thing. And there's no reflection. There's no point where he says, well, perhaps we could have done this or perhaps we could have done that. He doesn't really know the history. He's quite surprised to hear that Doctor went on for 4 more years. And I think, much as I like Matthew Sweet, there are a couple of times when I wish he'd been a little bit firmer. I think there's a point at the beginning of the interview where Grade says, well, no one was watching Doctor Who. No one was watching it. Well, this is not true. I think Attack of the Cybermen had nearly 9 million viewers, and it dipped to about 6 million viewers, which is not no one is watching. Now, by 1984-85 standards, that's not a massive viewing figure, because at the time you had Coronation Street and EastEnders, which I think had just started with getting 18-20 million viewers. So obviously Doctor Who wasn't doing well. But I think it's a bit disingenuous to say no one was watching Doctor Who, because that's clearly not true. And I would have liked Matthew Sweet to have stepped in and said, well, actually, that's not strictly true. It had a strong, committed core audience. I think suggesting no one's watching it is a bit sweeping. And a bit later on, he talks about when Doctor Who was scheduled against Coronation Street. It was just a way of sort of damage limitation. Nothing was going to dent Coronation Street. Doctor Who wasn't considered important. It wasn't going to do any better anywhere else. So they just threw it against Doctor Who, against Coronation Street. And later on, though, he does say that he felt that Doctor Who's resources could have been better spent on something more prestigious and more creative and more original. But yet he's just admitted throwing Doctor Who away. So that money that was thrown away on Doctor Who wouldn't necessarily have gone to something new, and if it had, would it have ended up in that same time slot? So there's a couple of points where whether Matthew Sweet is trying to sort of sweeten Michael Grade a little bit to keep him on side. I'm not sure. I would have liked to have seen Matthew being a bit more of a terrier, but he's never really able to penetrate that sort of smugness that Michael Grade's always had. But it's still an interesting piece. Beyond Doctor Who, he talks about other things. And you realise how much TV has changed, how it was ratings driven at the time, and how the BBC was a very different place at the time, how shows could be commissioned on the spot from a very quick 3-word pitch, whereas now, as he says, there's meetings and sub-meetings and overviews and audience reactions, and then shows don't get commissioned. It's a very different TV world now. That's interesting. But I think some of his Doctor Who stuff is a bit sort of stonewalling, because you can't get him to admit, I did something wrong, or perhaps we should have done this, he stands by the view he took in 1984, which I suppose is commendable in a way, but it would have been nice to have seen a bit of reflection of, well, I've stepped back now and thought, yeah, perhaps this, perhaps that. But no, he still firmly takes the party line that what he did then was the right thing and he has no regrets, which is, I suppose, fair enough. But it's frustrating that Matthew Sweet can't chip away at that veneer that Michael Grade's always had. Much more enjoyable in a different ways are the interviews with Colin Baker and Nicola Bryant. Colin Baker interview is about nearly an hour and a half, and it's absolutely fascinating. I've always liked Colin Baker. I'm not a fan of his portrayal of the Doctor, not necessarily his fault. I think the writing let him down, his terrible costume let him down, and occasionally his performance veers into the overly theatrical, but I think that's down to the scripts that give him clunky, clumsy dialogue. But Colin Baker, as an actor, comes across as a person, particularly in this interview, comes across as very thoughtful, very considered, very, very erudite. Considering he's now 78, he's sharp as a pin. His opinions are very well expressed, very well considered, very well presented. He's very knowledgeable about the industry. He's very old school character actor, the type that we don't really get too often these days. And the interview doesn't necessarily focus all that much on his troubled time in Doctor Who. The first 45 minutes or so are very much the history of Colin Baker. Some people might find that a bit dry and uninteresting, but it's actually fascinating to hear him talk about his family and his upbringing and how he went into law but really wanted to become an actor, and his time and things like the brothers. Some amusing anecdotes about how early in his career he was doing lots of quite intimate scenes in dramas that were difficult for a new actor. It's just interesting to hear an actor of his experience talking about his career broadly rather than just when he became the Doctor. Of course, that is touched upon. But what's more interesting again is how he talks very, very touchingly and heartwarmingly about the cot death that his family, he and his wife suffered just before he started working on Doctor Who. They just had a baby called Jack who passed away from cot death. I think it's called sudden infant death syndrome. You don't hear quite as much of it now, which is a good thing, because I think there's been a lot of work done, a lot of education done on the causes and the prevention and so on. But he talks very, very poignantly about the effect that had on him and still has on him. And there's a couple of points where he sort of, even now, 30, nearly 40 years later, he's still very, very touched by it and affected by it. And that was more important to him than being Doctor Who. And it's quite interesting that this was literally weeks before he started rehearsing Doctor Who. And as he says, all the nervousness and anticipation of being the Doctor went because that didn't seem important anymore. It was just a job he was doing. And you sort of understand a bit more about him and why everything that happened then with the cancellation and his sacking from Doctor Who, he was able to put it in a perspective. It wasn't the big drama it could have been, because he'd been through something far, far worse in a domestic situation. It's a great interview. It's so interesting, and he's so interesting to listen to. I've met him a couple of times, actually, Colin Baker. I met him, bit of anecdote for you here. I met him back in, would be 88, just before the trial of a Time Lord season. No, not 88, it would be 85, 86. 86, just before the trial of a Time Lord season started. He came to South Wales to open a new furniture warehouse place just outside Cardiff. I think it's long gone now. And I went to see him there, and he was in full costume, and I managed to nab an interview with him. And of course, he was full of enthusiasm for the new season, not realising that even then he was sort of moved around the way to get rid of him from the show. And he's, he was much younger then, but he was sort of full of enthusiasm. And then I met him, not directly, but I saw him at a Cardiff science fiction convention a couple of years back, where he did a sort of a Q&A, which is really interesting. He's such an interesting man, and it's a really good feature. Equally good, however, is the feature with Nicola Bryant, which again runs to over an hour. And this is fascinating in very, very different ways, because this does focus a lot on her career, because her career began with Doctor Who. She was just out of drama school. I mean, she looks great for 61, I've got to say, wow. But she talks about getting the role in Doctor Who and how she put on an American accent, because that's what they're looking for. And her agent, Terry Carney, who incidentally was William Hartnell's grandson by relation to William Hartnell's granddaughter, if you like. He was her agent. And she went into Doctor Who putting on an American accent, because she wasn't American and they were looking for an American actor. But Terry Carney, her agent, had a good feeling about it. He felt, no, I think you're right for this. And she tells how she kept that accent all the way through Doctor Who without telling anybody apart from Colin Baker. She wasn't actually American. And it's interesting, they even show a clip from a Breakfast Time thing where she talks in the American accent and comes up with the story that she has dual nationality or something. She didn't. She was putting on an accent. She never told John Nathan Turner, all through her time on the programmes, had to keep up this pretense. But what's even more interesting, and you could view it by today's standards as a bit sinister, is the fact that John Nathan Turner, the producer, did exercise this strange controlling relationship over her. Matthew Sweet compares it at one point to the sort of Alfred Hitchcock Tippi Hedren thing in The Birds, where he was fascinated with her in an unhealthy way. Now, I don't think that's quite the same with John Nathan Turner, but he sort of took the rediscovered Nicola Bryant. But he had complete control over her career and the way she presented herself on screen. Her costumes were all dictated by him. The way she behaved, the work she did, was all dictated by him. And that I think shows how things have changed since then, that sort of thing, post #MeToo would not happen now, and shouldn't happen now, because, it's creepy. But he had her to control over her career in ways that we now find very disturbing. And it's fascinating to hear her talk about it. And she sort of admits that it happened. Not that she allowed it to happen, but she, the culture at the time was you didn't speak up. You didn't stand up for yourself. And it's fascinating. She comes across as somebody who, I think she probably knows her career post-Doctor Who. She's still working. She still does lots of things, but yeah, she should have been a bigger star. Something I always said about Elizabeth Sladen, should have been a major star in British television. She should have been doing all these sort of Helen Mirren-y, Leslie Manville type things, because she was, she should have been, but she didn't get those breaks for some reason. Elizabeth Sladen, I think, put family before her career, which is, fine, but she should have been a much bigger star. And I think possibly the same with Nicola Bryant. Watching her in these episodes, in the clips of the episodes, you sort of think, wow, this character is so underwritten. Because Perry is just running around after the Doctor, looking anxious, scared, not understanding what's going on. And that classic Doctor Who companion way, and you do think how far the show has moved in its presentation of its companion characters, were much more rounded and much more individual and independent now. But Perry is literally clattering around after the Doctor, the classic "what's going on, I don't understand" thing, and it's fairly completely unrewarding role, I would think, for a performer. But she comes across really well in the interview. Matthew Sweet, again, is fascinated by this charade that she kept up throughout her time in Doctor Who. She was American. He's just sort of stunned that could happen. It's a terrific piece. And as I said, those 3 interviews are the USPs of this box set. So if you're undecided about getting it, and if you haven't started digging into it yet, apologies if there are spoilers here. But I did want to talk about these features in depth because they're important and they're very good. I will stop here because I know this video's gone on for well over 20 minutes, and that's not a really good thing. So that's my brief overview of the season 22 of Doctor Who, now on Blu-ray. You've got all the stuff that came over from the original DVDs. I know there are extended episodes here and there, remixed sounds, tracks, immersive 5.1 surround sound mix for Attack of the Cybermen. You've got extras like Slip Back, The Radio Adventure. There are extended episodes, as I said, a couple of other episodes, new visual effects on Time Lash, studio footage. So there's a lot of other new material on there, which I haven't looked at yet, but because I tend to go for these features rather than odds and sods. So it is a good box set for a poor season, and I'm going to give it, as a box set, 6 out of 10. But it's definitely worth it for those 5 exclusive new features and those behind the scenes and those behind the sofa features. It is another very well presented archived Doctor Who release, and it reminds us how lucky we are and how well served we are that the BBC make this effort for what is still, I suppose, fairly niche product, classic Doctor Who, but it is worth it, and it's, you know, it's another piece in the jigsaw puzzle of classic Doctor Who on Blu-ray. Right, thank you for watching. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you watch the Blu-ray, any of these features I've been talking about. Let me know what you think of the whole set, what set you think should come next. I think it's expected that season 20, Peter Davison's season, will come out next, which I'm not sure about. I'd rather have Pertwee or Tom Baker personally, but there we are. Let me know what you think could be coming up soon in the Blu-ray box sets. As I say, leave a comment down below, like and subscribe, tell your friends, and until I see you next time, keep taking the stuff.